much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for coming. I didn't know I could do a performance. Maybe I can also do that, because I like to see myself as an entertainer, so I will try to entertain you. But probably my presentation won't help very much, but I have nice visuals. So, and also I have an opening that I always like. Just because I feel very old lately, I feel a disconnect with my audience. But since you're not students, most of you it seems, I use this as a test to see my connection with the generation that I'm teaching. So okay, so you know what this is, right? Oh, yeah. Okay, so this is from the Star Wars universe. And I like to start my discussion on planetary urbanization with that, just because it's so funny. At the beginning, people were asking, "Oh, are you talking about a planet that is built up and things like that, right?" But no, it's actually, for me, much more interesting, the question and the relation to science fiction. And it's also a rule of thumb to know where you're doing good science fiction, for me at least. So in science fiction, you take some decisions about the future, like you change something in the future, but then you have to be very consistent about it, right? And you have to be extremely, specific in how you solve the contradictions that you are creating, right? So in this universe, there is indeed this planet, which is the completely urbanized planet, right? This is the city planet, right? All the, political decisions take place there, but not a lot of the action takes place there. The interesting thing is, if you have in your universe this planet, you need to then have another planet that is producing the food, right? And another planet that is mining, that you can also build your cities, right? So it's quite nice. I was very happy to see that in this universe, you have this metabolic consistency at the universal level, right? And of course, this is the basis of the discussion I want to have today, and unpack a bit more the geographical dimension of the question of urban metabolism. So obviously, in our planet Earth, we have all these planets together. This is a series of data spheres. These are stills from a video we did for the Architecture Biennale, the COVID one. I think it was in 2020 something. Yeah. Anyway, that's a video. If you can look it up, you can see it. And the whole idea here is exactly to show that we have this overlapping planets on planet Earth. They have to do with the metabolism of urbanization. We have population, we have agriculture, mining, fishing, all these things on the same planet, right? And somehow, in an abstract way, all these land uses are like that, right? But this is just an introduction of a quite key for me point that I cannot stress enough, that at the basis of this question of the metabolic landscapes of urbanization is an understanding that urbanization is a form of geometabolic interdependency, right? You can say urbanization is many things, right? It's about population concentration, cities, culture, innovation, politics, anything, right? But I really like this quote here by an economist, Paul Byroch, from 40 years ago, that he says, he's very confident, he says, the essence of the city, so if we really want to define it, right, it's this spatial division of labor, I guess, right, the specialization of activities that lead to these concentrations incapable of sustaining themselves, right? So you actually need to have this interdependency, right? So the whole idea here is, because there is a lot of discussion about these broader landscapes beyond the city and how they are configured, and if this is really about, the urbanization question, right? The point here is that you would probably have a very different set of these planets, right? If population on the planet, maybe even the same population, was distributed in a very different manner, right? And I will come back to that, because I think a lot of the discussions about future alternative forms of what we can do differently maybe somehow fail to address this question, that we still have these extremely large concentrations of population, of economic activity. We really have these forms of what Neil and Christian here introduced as concentrated urbanization, right? So understanding this interdependency means not only understanding, the concentration of population, economic activity, infrastructure investment, but also what it means for the landscapes that are being saved. Because of them, I will not really unpack the framework because I understand you're familiar with it, but we can also talk more about it. So this is a framework that tries to do exactly that, understand urbanization as a form of geometabolic interdependency, right? Highlighting that you cannot have concentrated urbanization without having these landscapes that support it, the metabolic landscapes of primary production, circulation, waste disposal. At the same time, these landscapes would not be configured like that if you didn't have population and economic activities concentrated in cities, right? And I think this is quite interesting because, for example, in Europe, it's very evident that our urbanization moment becomes more and more about extended urbanization. It's about the relationship of urbanization with its material basis. A lot of the questions around energy transition, food, all these questions are not really about cities growing so much. I mean, we have still cities that are growing in Europe, even if we don't really have the urbanization rates that we have in Africa. Right? But most of the issues that we have are about this relationship with the material basis that supports urbanization, right? And it's also important to consider that these are not relationships that are fixed. At some point you solve it and it's done, right? They are always being reconfigured, and I think right now it's again a very good moment to see how we are reconstructing completely these relationships that our cities had with their landscapes of extended urbanization. My work is very much trying to spatialize this question. And I'm really not doing a lot of progress, unfortunately. I find it really hard. And one of the reasons is the persistence of this concept of the hinterland as something that is in our minds very similar to this thing, right? And this thing is nothing else than von Thunen's model from the mid-19th century, right? Von Thunen introduced some very interesting questions. One of the surprises that I had is if you ever read a very early paper by David Harvey on the spatial fix, he really discusses von Thunen in a very interesting way, and how he calculates the frontier wage of all these things, right? But for our purposes, I use it here as a key example that somehow encapsulates our idea of this metabolic relationship, right? We have in mind that there is a city and there is this hinterland of the city somewhere, right? Even these ideas of the footprint, for example, they somehow replicate this idea that you have a city which something like doesn't take up a lot of space, right? And there is a larger area that somehow supports this city. I mean, obviously, this model was not there to solve, metabolism, but it has all the elements somehow that this isolated state needs to sustain itself, right? It has mining, it has wood, which is basically fuel and building materials, and then it has the zones of agriculture. And it has also this very interesting framing, which is also, I think, very relevant still to models that we have today. So, he creates this very abstract geography, of course, and there are some interesting things. The first of all is that there is this, in a very nice way, this reflection on this spatial and social division of labor. So certain functions happen in the city, exchange happens in the city, industrial production happens in the city, and then primary production happens in this hinterland area, right? But the interesting thing is that you cannot really have trade outside of this isolated state, right? So everything you do circulates within this bounded region, right? So keep that in mind, because I think this is still something that a lot of contemporary ideas, especially around ecoregionalism, keep putting back without really questioning how you can really limit the circulation of this surplus within this isolated state. Of course, obviously, the situation, this very contiguous, very regional, very direct exchange that is happening there, a quite diverse hinterland, is not the case today, right? This is also why this hinterland concept becomes so problematic if we really want to understand the specialities of this metabolic condition of urbanization today. However, if you think about it, this model here is extremely, it doesn't really have a scale, right? it's in its abstraction, it's quite interesting because it doesn't say, oh, this is a region, this is how large the city is. It just says it's a very large city, it's a very large plain. They figure it out, right? So you can actually even extrapolate and say, what if in this model we say Fontunen's very large city is the complete assemblage of all the human settlements, right? And then you can start overlaying all these other zones that he has, right? So Fontunen's world today is obviously a very different thing, right? So I'm really scratching my head all these years to try to understand a bit the spatial logic behind the organization of all these landscapes that support our city, right? Because obviously it's not this regional hinterland anymore, right? And it's a question to what extent you can actually still even figure out if these hinterlands are about direct relationships between cities or if it's like the whole assemblage of cities sharing hinterlands, right? So all my research has been about that. And the first thing I tried to do was somehow to understand a bit the process of how this relationship has been transformed under planetary urbanization in the past 200 years. And the first point, of course, was to understand a bit that a lot of the discussion in urbanism, in urban studies, was about these different forms of agglomeration, right? And there was very little discussion about how these different forms of agglomeration, the post-metropolis, all these urbanized regions, were creating new types of hinterlands, right? But surprisingly, if you go back to Jean Gottman's book, Megalopolis, I don't know if you are familiar with the actual book. I guess you're familiar with the concept, right? I mean, half of the book is about, obviously, the northeastern seaboard of the United States and the new forms of agglomeration that are emerging there. And there is a lot of discussion about what he calls megalopolitan agriculture, right? So he basically says there is no town and country anymore. The new relationship that we have is between specialized urbanized regions and specialized regions of agriculture, of primary production, right? And he presents here the example of the Midwest of the United States with the Corn Belt and the Wheat Belt and all these things. He even examines the growth of the hydrological footprint of New York City that you can see there with all the reservoirs, all the systems that are bringing water to you. So there is, again, this metabolic question that you wouldn't be able to have this post-metropolitan condition if you hadn't changed the relationship and upscaled it somehow with these new hinterlands that are becoming equally specialized, right? So this whole region now is an urbanized region, but at the same time, other regions are becoming specialized in supporting it because this metabolism is being upscaled, right? Of course, at the basis of this is often very violent commodification processes together with deparasitization that remove actually the possibility of having subsistent forms of existence, right? Exactly the construction of this Midwestern agricultural system, I think, is the best example ever with the expropriation, violent expropriation of land, commodification perfectly with this, very, very efficient way of selling the plots, right? And then, you end up having this model of agriculture, which since day one was never going to support this vision of a nation of subsistent farmers. Since day one, this is about export-oriented farming, actually, to a very large degree. So obviously, none of this would be possible if you could not really circulate all this surplus. So you really need development of transport systems. Something that was very interesting, because we often think of transportation as something that really has to do with cost and accessibility, right? Oh, the cost is very cheap, we can just ship things around, right? But we don't really pay attention in the spatial layout of infrastructural systems. And I found this moment of infrastructural convergence quite interesting. So at some point, transportation systems that are somehow regional start covering, accessibility quite homogeneously across space. And I will give you an example here. So these are railways, again in the United States, and you can see how they start growing. They don't really connect things that are very far away, right, from each other. You can see it mostly here. They mostly connect regions, right? See how much more dense these regional connections are, right? So you still somehow replicate this spatial logic of the monocentric hinterland model. You have somewhere like a city which is the gateway of trade, and things go there, and from there they actually circulate, right? At some point, obviously, these networks start becoming much more universal in the way they transcend space, right? So obviously, you cannot really have Chicago as a gateway without having these railways that you see here. These are the cows in Chicago stockyard, famously, right? But also today, you cannot really say that there are certain regional connections that are so specific and they really limit this spatial connectivity in terms, at least, of in terms of transport, at least. So somehow the spatial dimensions of this transportation development, I think it's somehow missing from the equation of understanding the development of the hinterland. Obviously, mechanization has a lot to do with the fact that economies of scale associated with it really create this specialization of land uses when it has to do with primary sectors of the economy. To me, it was quite important to understand how much economies of scale are almost the sole driver of profit making and cost suppression in these economies, right? So imagine, you have a tractor, you have to buy it, somehow you invest capital. The more land you have and the more this land somehow can utilize this tractor in the same way, obviously the more you suppress this cost. And obviously you have eventually this globalization of primary production, which somehow evades our imagination. I think we have it more connected with still the colonial and post-colonial structure of the world. Like, this globalization somehow happened as part of the early industrialization of Europe, right? Which you can see here. I really like this map because it's in the 50s. I think it's a great reflection, really, of still the colonial era of trade, right? You still have the manufacturing core, you have some areas of exchange from which you can appropriate ecological value, and even you have some subsistent regions, which is quite interesting, actually, so regions that are not participating in world trade, right? So we forget that this was not the only moment where this primary production was globalized. It kept being horizontally articulated together with everything else after the 1950s, right? And we have much more complicated systems of articulation of food systems, obviously minerals, raw materials. This is from a study that we did to understand a bit the mythification of diets in Asia and how it had an impact on the global commodity chains of feed and soybeans especially, and corn, and how it also activated a lot of parts of the global south. So a much more complicated image than the core periphery model again. So final point, all this leads somehow to this very specific type of landscape, which is very specialized. It has a global function, and it leads always to this plantation-like simplified landscapes. And here again, a map showing you the concentration of cultivation of soybean and corn in the US. You just see it's all in one spot, and 80% of this area is just landscapes that look like that, right? So it's this landscape that is familiar to us, obviously resulting in a huge metabolic rift. If you have this specialization at the global, at the planetary level, you are circulating these metabolic flows at the global level, and you create also a lot of opportunities for exchange that are at the base of inequality. I have this set of maps here because, to my knowledge, this is the best example that I was able to find from Luke Berkman, geographer at UBC, who tried to systematically understand the percentage of primary production in each part of the world that is dedicated to supporting consumption globally. Right? So it's kind of, to me, the best approximation of mapping these globalized primary production landscapes. Look up the publication if you want. It's called Land in Motion. To a certain extent, it's a bit technical, but also it has some very interesting results in it. So we have to get rid of this concept as a spatial concept to understand metabolism, right? We introduced this idea of the operational landscape to understand these landscapes that are globalized. They are not regional anymore. They are somehow splintered right? Remember a bit the argument on splintering urbanism by Graham and Marvin, how they were actually discussing that urbanization creates these enclaves that are splintered around the world. In the same way, we can investigate these primary production landscapes are splintered enclaves of super specialized production. They are networked, right? They are not really linked directly to a city. They are probably linked to very complex global commodity chains, and they are quite specialized in what they're doing. I just have a list of maps here. I did them on purpose on a very dark background, so they can actually appear like islands or enclaves of specialized production around the world, and you can see what this production is. Very interesting, for example, 90% of palm oil production, it happens in Indonesia, right? So again, these are super specialized landscapes. So you cannot really ask, who is this for? What city is this for? Obviously, it's for the whole assemblage of concentrated urbanization, right? And different things, right? But I think the most important thing, these landscapes are obviously extremely different. The relationship they have with the areas of consumption are very different, and sometimes very direct, sometimes very indirect. So obviously, not all these landscapes are globalized, not all these landscapes are becoming operational, and this is for me the tricky part, right? You cannot really see the global cropland landscape and say all of them are equally globalized, or all of them are equally specialized. We don't really know which landscapes support more local economies, which not. It's very actually difficult to do. But we can do, again, very rough approximations, at least at this level, through mapping that shows you what extent of these landscapes, for example, is dedicated to cultivate crops that can be consumed by humans directly, right? And you can see a lot of areas in Asia, especially in India, are for that. And you can see actually how the system in North America, even in Europe, even in South America, largely, unfortunately, is now dedicated for the production of feed, right? So if you overlay these two maps, suddenly you have a much more complicated understanding of this global cropland landscape, right? So in some cases, this landscape is not really feeding any city, although if you go there, they are very proud of feeding, the world, right? But they're basically feeding the cows that you see here, and you can already see the result of the concentration of these animals on the right, which is the excrement of the cows. By the way, this is by design. It's basically just following the guidelines of the USDA. So this was kind of my effort to understand a bit the specialities of it, which were the processes that construct so large-scale, simplified landscapes, right? But above all, the main reason these landscapes look like they do is that they are basically profit landscapes, right? So this geometabolic interdependency of urbanization, the way it is resolved, is not necessarily in the most efficient way, it's not necessarily in the most sustainable way, it's most of the times in the most profitable way. And this is where, for me, it gets very interesting, because also you can link it back to discussions around the cities as growth machines, right? And the cities are actually sources of surplus, right? And to me also that was the starting point of my investigation, because I was initially looking at global cities, right? And I was trying to understand the emergence of global hinterlands, right? And back then, 20 years ago, there was a lot of discussion how cities are quite successful in, creating the platforms for economic growth, for innovation, for all these things, agglomeration effects. Richard Florida popularized a map like that with a spiky world, right? You might have seen it there, right? And on the other hand, there was a lot of discussion, and still is, that cities from an ecological perspective are like these black holes that are just consuming ecological value and producing waste. So, and this is an effort to actually show how from a ecological perspective, from a consumption of biomass perspective, these spikes now are not about production, they're about consumption, right? And the question would be where all this consumption takes place. It's, you guessed it probably right, it's in the areas that in this map of GDP appear empty, right? So I tried to also make this reverse map of the spiky world here to show all these areas in between that are responsible, in this case, for producing the biomass that is consumed in these cities, right? And in understanding a bit this relationship of the spatial logic of the production of this value in the more than city areas, I found this framework from Jason Moore very helpful. Environmental historian. He developed also the concept of the capital scene, in which we framed the concept of operational landscapes. And the whole idea here is that I think for a long time we are more focused in on trying to understand how exploitation happens through the domain of paid work, right? Through actually, labor time. But he actually introduces this concept of the ecological surplus to highlight how a lot of surplus value comes from the appropriation of work that is not even part of the commodified system of work. It's not about labor anymore, right? It's part of this broadly defined socially necessary, labor time. But here he unpacks it, right? And he links it to questions of social reproduction, the unpaid work of human nature, for example, raising kids and things like that, but also in the case of the hinterland, and this is why I found it so interesting, the unpaid work of more than human systems of work. So plants, animals, all these organisms that are working and are contributing something without even being part of a commodified system. And this is schematically an effort to understand how, if we, let's say, have this broad definition of areas of concentrated urbanization, where the agglomeration economies take place, and obviously people are more concentrated, and if we have these landscapes of extended urbanization that are largely specialized, globalized, and take the form of these operational landscapes, how the domain of the unpaid work of more than humans is this domain of the operational landscape, right? That's why I think it's also interesting to consider how the world is populated, not just in terms of the human population that you see on the left, but also in terms of the more than human population that you see on the right, which is actually around, if I remember correctly, something like 3-4 billion cattle, swine, pigs, and poultry all together. There's something like 40-50 billion at any moment, right? And I think we have very little understanding of how they are distributed in terms of density, how their distribution in terms of density creates its own metabolic demands, right? So if we think of cities having their hinterlands, the distribution of these more than human organisms also creates metabolic demands that we actually have a very little understanding of. This is, maybe you have seen it in the news, this from Reuters. These are these vertical pig farms in China. I think now maybe they're even bigger than those. So you have thousands of pigs being reproduced in there and harvested. And you can actually very easily now make the analogy to a city having its hinterland. Now this is a hinterland that has its own hinterland, its own metabolic system of support, right? Interestingly, from this ecological surplus idea of Jason Moore, you can even infer one more layer in understanding the operationalization of these landscapes. So for Jason Moore, again, this is trying to visualize a bit his work. The level of ecological surplus that you see in these curves, so this curve corresponds to ecological surplus, which is something like a ratio of how much capital you have to invest to appropriate unpaid work. So the less capital and the more unpaid work, the higher is the ecological surplus, right? But after a while, interestingly, the capacity of these more than human systems to contribute unpaid work, or even human systems to contribute unpaid work, starts being exhausted. So you need to start commodifying things that were before cheap. I think a good example is what happens to agriculture if you are very intensive with farming, right? You exhaust the soil. So something that used to be free, the fertility of the soil, now you have to do something about it. What do? You bring fertilizers, right? You need to pay for the fertilizers. To do the fertilizers, you actually need to appropriate some other source of ecological surplus, which in the case of synthetic fertilizers, it's nitrogen from natural gas, right? So you have cheap energy, you exhaust the soil, you take something from another domain of ecological surplus and you substitute it. So you somehow have these phases in the landscapes that eventually exhaust them, and you can even think of the operationalization of landscapes as having this final moment in which the fully operationalized landscape, the operational landscape, is unable to contribute any ecological surplus, basically. You have to pay for everything. Think of these farms, for example, here, right? You have no relationship to the soil, you have to bring in all the feed, you have to probably have vaccination because of the high densities, you have to remove all the waste. There is very little that nature is contributing in terms of work except for growing the animal, right? So this is the last thing that you can still take out of it. I'll just go through that quickly because it's just diagrams trying to show you the jump between the different domains of ecological surplus. Again, to me, a very easy way to understand this moment of operationalization is if you observe the frontiers of expansion of the different operational landscapes. So I have these maps here, obviously very generalizing, but still they give you an idea of the evolution of very intensive farming in certain parts of the world over the most suitable areas to farm. So the more blue, the more suitable, let's say, to farm, and the darker the red, the more intensive the farming, right? And you can see how it extends. It takes over, obviously, in the 19th century with the expansion, all these prairies in North America. And we're in a situation right now that basically all the landscapes that can be farmed or all the ecological surplus that could be appropriated in a very cheap way, they're somehow exhausted. And you can see the only remaining ones are in the rainforests in Brazil, in Central Africa, some in Siberia. Maybe Putin will be happy with climate change as well. But you can actually see the closing of these frontiers, right? So more and more now, these landscapes are dependent upon finding ways to allow them to keep contributing work, right? So final point, and I put it this more as points to discuss also, because I'm in urbanism department, and always people are very interested about what can we do, right? And okay, yes, you convinced us, but what to do about it? And I think, unfortunately, the lack of this better spatial imagination around this hinterland or these landscapes of geometabolic net dependence leads us to things that are very similar to, for example, von Thunen's model, right? I have here, there are very many examples like this. I have here this one from Herbert Girardet, maybe you have seen it, from his book on regenerative cities. And he basically recreates a bit this regional hinterland, and the idea is that the solution is to localize the footprint, localize the ecological functions, and he even presents it as something that was there before and was somehow undone by the Petropolis, right, which is basically this moment of globalization, right? So this is somehow, in a bit romanticized way, the archetypal idea, how the relationship of cities and hinterlands used to be. Globalization happened and it disappeared, it got exploded, right? Also a lot of my maps try to show how it got exploded, right? But the question is ecopolis now the way forward, or is it really the way back? I have here a series of points that I found interesting. I collected them from a paper by Bill Rees. William Rees is the person who introduced this idea of the ecological footprint, the urban footprint. He was really an advocate of ecoregionalism. And he has a series of points if you really want to be serious about what to do with the footprint, right? So basically consolidate as much as possible of the eco footprint, right? Human population, this is for me very interesting, needs to be controlled. If you really want to define an ecological region, you also need to define the population of this ecological region, because the ecosystem, population is part of the ecosystem. It's not just the capacity, right? So these are two sides of the same coin. Very interesting point, and I'm afraid that we're going to see it more and more also in front of us as an argument around migration flows and such, right? So imagine you want to build a sustainable city, you somehow manage to have all this local agriculture, but then more people come to your city. What can you do, right? A good argument is, oh, we are really very sustainable right now. We cannot really undo all these very nice ecological regions that we have succeeded. So, sorry, we cannot really grow, right? So, also transform urban regional governance into a form of ecological governance. Interesting, in the Netherlands you also have it with the water boards in some extent, but look how techno-scientific the water boards are actually. So again, it's questionable where you go with that. And again, all these other points, I think, somehow reflect how you can make this consolidation happen, right? You need some form of a lot of power at the regional level, so you can really have control over the resources, reduce the reliance on trade, right? So only trade, things that are necessary. I think these are probably very familiar arguments, right? This is also a very interesting point, that the densification of the urban core does not only facilitate agglomeration economies, but also is good for sustainability multipliers because you create synergies. And to me, this is an interesting point, because if you didn't have this point, to me, it would be like reading Mumford from 100 years ago when he was talking about regions and how large cities are very bad, right? Obviously, large cities are very bad for the environment in terms of Mumford, but Mumford had really no appreciation of how good density is supposed to be, right? So all this Jane Jacobs kind of discussion around agglomeration economies was not there yet. Now it's there, but it's somehow complementary to the ecological dimension, right? So there is no question how densifying an area increases the footprint, right? This is also somehow unclear here. And then, to me, my favorite part, if you actually also look at the history of urbanization, you understand that trade between the regions was not just a way to profit, but it was also a way to create ecological resilience, right? Because if a region fails in something, they can still source from other regions. If you're very self-sufficient in a region and something happens, right, ecological risk, then somehow you're in a very difficult position to recreate these connections that you don't have, right? And the second approach I have here, just because the one has a very specific scale, right, and the other somehow doesn't have a very specific scale, but still, if you look at a lot of projects around circularity, they somehow again seem to imply that there is the right scale for circularity. So the one is the eco-regionalist approach, the second is the circularity approach that I have here. And here, the emphasis is not so much on the dimensions and the boundaries, it's actually the circulation and the connections and the synergies between things. And you might have seen all these, R strategies and how they translate to spatial projects. I'm also guilty of having done a lot of projects with circularity in mind, so these are from our students, and normally they end up very happily saying, oh, we are going to have a circular region that somehow looks like the eco-region, right? And then some connections between the regions are still possible as long as they're somehow also closing the loops, right? But again, it's an interesting question. What's the right scale for circularity, right? And what happens when you actually extend the scales? So I just have this series of points here to consider. It's impossible to actually think the one without the other. It's impossible to solve this hinterland question without thinking that this exists because our cities are actually as they are. They are quite large. I think 1/3 of global population is going to be living in cities of 1 or more million. And especially if we really don't want to have such a Eurocentric perspective, we forget that cities elsewhere are still growing very rapidly, right? And they're growing very rapidly with the same logic in mind that, oh, let's mechanize, agricultural production and free up labor so they can move in the cities, right? So it's exactly the same logic that you somehow have this rural-urban migration supporting city growth, which is happening, right? So what to do with these cities? Can you really decentralize them so easily? I think it's a very difficult task. The second point, extended urbanization, all these landscapes are already configured in such ways that would actually also mean that reshaping them would require a lot of repair, right? It's not just tabula rasa, let's create a new relationship with the hinterland. All these landscapes are already configured in a particular way, infrastructure is there, and just the two final points, what I was just discussing, maybe it's not so much about the dimensions and the scales, which would probably need to be also at least multiscalar, even global, but maybe about understanding the conditions of production and circulation. And I think there is very little discussion around that, and a lot of discussion how to localize things, how to close the loops, right? And actually very little is being said about the conditions of these loops and the conditions of localizing these things, right? And obviously the last question, I just put it just because it's interesting to also consider new waves of automation, mechanization, with big data, with AI, and what it means for the hybridization of this human, more than human interface. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nikos.